The night I slept under a highway overpass, I counted 43 cars pass above me and wondered if any of those drivers had ever truly lost everything. Not misplaced something. Not temporarily struggled. Lost everything, the way a fire loses its last ember, quietly, without drama, without anyone watching. I had. 41 years old, divorced, fired, evicted, in that order, inside of 6 months. And the strangest part was how ordinary each moment felt as it happened. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. I signed them at the kitchen table with a pen that had a chewed cap, and I remember thinking I should probably buy a new pen. The firing happened on a Thursday, in a glass-walled office where my manager kept glancing at the parking lot like he was expecting someone more important to arrive. The eviction notice was taped to my door on a Saturday morning, which felt almost insulting. Saturdays were supposed to be for something else. My savings lasted 3 weeks. My pride lasted a little longer, but not much. I told myself I was between situations. That was the phrase I used, even internally, even alone, between situations, as though homelessness were a layover and I simply needed to locate my connecting gate. I called 2 friends in the first week. One didn't answer. The other answered, listened for 4 minutes, and then mentioned that his wife had been dealing with something difficult too, and somehow the conversation shifted entirely in her direction, and I never brought my situation up again. I did not call anyone after that. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone but from realizing that your disappearance from the world would create almost no disturbance in it. I felt that loneliness like a stone in my chest, smooth and permanent and surprisingly easy to carry once you got used to the weight. By December, I was carrying everything I owned in a canvas duffel bag. A change of clothes, a rain jacket with a broken zipper, a phone that could no longer hold a charge for more than 40 minutes, a small photograph of my daughter taken at a school play 3 years earlier when she was dressed as a sunflower and laughing at something happening just off camera. I kept that photograph in the front pocket of the bag, separated from everything else, as if proximity to other objects might somehow diminish it. I ate gas station sandwiches when strangers left change on the counter. I learned which libraries opened earliest and which security guards were willing to let you sit for 4 hours without asking questions. I learned that the warmest spot in any public building is always near the boiler room, and that people rarely look directly at someone sitting on the floor against a wall, they look just above, into the comfortable middle distance where difficult things don't exist. The church volunteer found me on a frozen morning in the second week of December. She didn't approach me the way most people approached men in my situation, cautiously, with the particular smile that means I am helping you but please do not touch me. She walked directly toward me, sat down on the cold concrete beside me without hesitation, and handed me a folded newspaper and a paper cup of coffee so hot it nearly burned through my fingers. She didn't ask my name. She didn't offer hers. She simply said, "There's a section in there someone circled for you," and then she stood and walked back toward the church entrance without looking back. I have thought about her many times since. I never saw her again. Someone had circled an ad in red pen, pressed so hard the ink had bled slightly through to the next page. The words were simple: Mountain Quonset hut, private land, no utilities, $20 cash. Serious inquiries only. There was a phone number beneath it, local area code, no name. I read it 3 times. Then I read it 3 more times, not because I didn't understand the words but because something in the combination of them struck me as almost impossibly specific. $20. No utilities. Serious inquiries only. It felt less like a real estate listing and more like a message written in a language I was only just learning to read. I called the number from a library payphone, one of the last working payphones in the city, tucked in a corner near the periodicals section where no one ever went anymore. The phone rang 4 times. I was already preparing to hang up, already constructing the small internal story about how it probably wasn't real anyway, when the line connected. The man who answered didn't say hello. He said, "You're calling about the hut." Not a question. His voice was older, steady in the particular way that comes not from confidence but from having already survived every version of worry. I told him yes. He asked me one question, not about my income, not about my history, not about why I was calling from a payphone at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. He asked, "Are you the kind of person who can be alone with themselves for a long time?" I didn't answer immediately. In that pause, which lasted maybe 4 seconds, I understood that the pause itself was being noticed. I said I wasn't sure but that I was willing to find out. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come before dark." After that, I can't promise you'll find it. He gave me an address, a county road number and a landmark involving a lightning-struck pine, and then the line went quiet. I had $11 in my pocket. I spent 3 of them on bus fare to the edge of the city and stood at an on-ramp with my canvas duffel bag and my photograph of a sunflower girl and my broken zippered jacket, and I held out my thumb toward the mountains. The first car didn't stop. Neither did the second, or the 7th, or the 14th. But somewhere around the 20th, a pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a dog sleeping across the back seat pulled onto the gravel, and a woman with paint-stained hands leaned across the passenger seat and said, "How far?" I told her as far as she was going. She nodded once and said nothing else for 30 miles, which was the greatest gift anyone had given me in months. She dropped me at a junction that put me still 12 miles from the county road. I walked the last 4 of those miles as the light began dropping behind the ridge line, turning the sky the particular shade of orange that looks beautiful in photographs and feels entirely different when you are alone in it without shelter. My feet were wet. My jacket was doing almost nothing against the wind coming down through the pines. I kept the photograph in my hand for the last 2 miles, not for sentiment but because holding it made me walk faster. There are things we carry not because they comfort us but because they clarify what we are walking toward. I found the lightning-struck pine exactly where he said it would be. Split clean down the center, both halves still standing, the wood inside exposed and pale like something that hadn't expected to be seen. 20 yards past it, a dirt track curved left into the trees. I followed it until the track ended and the hut appeared in the last thin light, corrugated steel curved like the spine of some enormous sleeping animal, half buried in dead leaves and pine needles, so still and settled into its surroundings that it seemed less like a structure someone had built and more like something the mountain had simply decided to produce on its own. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long moment. In the weeks I had spent sleeping under overpasses and in library corners, I had stopped imagining futures. Not out of despair, exactly, but out of a kind of practical economy. Futures required energy, and I was rationing carefully. But standing in the clearing with the cold coming down through the trees and the sky going dark at the edges, something shifted in the base of my chest. Not hope, not yet. Something quieter than hope. Something that felt more like the moment just before you remember a word you thought you had forgotten, that sensation of the answer existing somewhere just inside you, moving toward the surface. The padlock on the door was rusted open, hanging by one arm like it had given up on its purpose a long time ago. I pushed the door with 2 fingers and it swung inward without resistance, without sound, as though it had been expecting exactly this weight, at exactly this hour. The smell that reached me was paper and pine resin and cold and something else underneath those things, something I could not immediately name but recognized the way you recognize a place you have only ever seen in a dream. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag over one shoulder and the photograph still in my hand, and I looked into the darkness of that small steel room, and I understood, with a certainty I could not have explained to anyone, that whatever was waiting inside that hut was the reason the church volunteer had sat down beside me on a frozen concrete sidewalk and pressed a newspaper into my hands without asking my name. I reached for the small flashlight clipped to my bag strap. And I stepped inside. The hut was smaller than I expected and older than the trees around it. Corrugated steel, curved and low, the kind of structure that makes you instinctively lower your head even when the ceiling is technically high enough, as though the building itself is asking something of you before you go any further inside. My flashlight beam moved across the walls slowly, the way you move a light when you are not entirely sure you want to see everything at once. And then the beam caught the first shelf and I stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. Books. Floor to ceiling, along every curved wall, fitted into handmade wooden shelves so precisely constructed that they followed the exact arc of the corrugated steel behind them. Hundreds of books. More than hundreds, the kind of quantity that stops being a number and becomes instead an atmosphere, a climate, a decision someone made about how to spend an entire life. Survival manuals with cracked spines sat beside poetry collections with unbroken ones. Philosophy leaned against field guides. Handwritten notebooks, dozens of them, were stacked horizontally in the gaps between volumes wherever the vertical space ran out, their covers marked in faded ink with dates and seasons and single words I couldn't yet read from where I stood. Someone had lived here. Not visited, not stored things, lived, the way people live when they have decided that the world outside a particular set of walls no longer has anything essential to offer them. I set my duffel bag down on the dirt floor and did not take my eyes off the walls. The flashlight beam continued its slow inventory. There was a narrow cot against the back curve of the hut, a wool blanket folded at its foot with the precise corners of someone who made that fold the same way every single morning. A small iron stove in the corner, cold now but with ash still sitting in it, gray and soft-edged, the way ash looks when it has been undisturbed for months rather than years. A wooden crate serving as a table. A single tin cup hanging from a nail above the stove. Everything in that space had been placed with intention. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was wasted. The entire interior carried the specific gravity of a life that had been edited down to only what was true. I moved to the nearest shelf and let my fingers run along the spines without pulling anything out yet. My hand stopped on a journal, not because it was larger than the others or marked in any particular way, but because it was the one my fingers reached first, and in that moment I had decided to trust small instincts over deliberate choices. I pulled it from the shelf and opened the cover. The handwriting inside was small and extremely even, the kind of handwriting that takes years to develop, the kind that suggests the person writing had learned early that words committed to paper deserved the same care as words spoken aloud to someone you loved. And then something fell from between the cover and the first page and landed on the dirt floor without a sound. I crouched and picked it up. A photograph. Black and white, slightly overexposed along one edge, the image of a man standing at a tree lean. He was thin, upright, wearing a jacket not unlike my own. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression I needed several seconds to identify because it was so unfamiliar in a face that otherwise looked remarkably like my own. He was looking at the camera the way a person looks when they have finally stopped being afraid of what they see in mirrors. The resemblance was not exact. But it was close enough to make my hand go still. Beneath the photograph, folded once along a clean crease, was a note. I unfolded it carefully, the way you handle things that feel as though they were not meant to survive this long. The handwriting matched the journal, small, even, unhurried. It said, if you found this, you needed to start with the red notebook. It will explain everything about the land, the water, the winters, and more importantly, about you. No signature. No date. No explanation of how he knew someone would come, or when, or in what condition they would arrive. Just those two sentences and the absolute certainty embedded in them, a certainty so complete it made my chest feel strange, the way it feels when someone accurately describes a thought you have never spoken out loud to anyone. I looked for the red notebook. It took me less than a minute to find it, a thick composition notebook with a faded red cover, sitting alone on the lowest shelf closest to the door, as though it had been placed there last, after everything else, specifically to be found first. I carried it to the cot, sat down, and opened it beneath the flashlight beam. The first page said, "This land belongs to whoever needs it most." That has always been the arrangement. If you are reading this, the arrangement has found you. And then, below that, a list. Not of rules. Not of warnings. A list of what the land provided, a spring 40 yards northeast of the hut that ran clean through every month of the year, a root cellar dug into the hillside 30 feet from the door that I had not noticed when I approached, a cord of dry wood stacked under a canvas tarp on the east side of the structure. Practical, precise, generous in the way that only deeply experienced knowledge can be generous, not offering comfort but offering capability, which is the more useful gift. I read for 2 hours without stopping. The red notebook was equal parts field manual and philosophy, shifting between them without announcement, as though the men who wrote it saw no meaningful difference between knowing how to bank a fire through a winter night and knowing why solitude, undertaken honestly, is not the same thing as loneliness. He wrote about the water table and he wrote about grief. He wrote about which pine varieties held their heat longest when burned, and he wrote about the particular freedom that arrives when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never truly listening. Every page moved forward. Every page assumed the reader was capable of more than they currently believed. Somewhere in the third hour I realized I was no longer cold. I had not lit the stove. The temperature inside the hut had not changed. But something else had, something in the way I was occupying my own body, the way I was sitting, the quality of attention I was bringing to the words on the page. I was present in a way I had not been present in months. Perhaps longer than months. I found my daughter in the pages too, though she was never mentioned. He wrote about regret as a compass rather than a weight, the idea that what we most regret reveals precisely what we most value, and that this information, if we are willing to read it honestly, tells us exactly where we should be directing whatever time and energy we have remaining. I read that passage 4 times. Then I took out the photograph of her in the sunflower costume and set it on the crate beside me and looked at it in the flashlight beam for a long time. She was laughing at something happening just off camera. She had always been able to find the thing just off camera. That was a quality I had never properly named before that night, and naming it felt like recovering something I had not known I had lost. By the time I reached the final pages of the red notebook, the quality of darkness outside the hut had shifted, that subtle change from deep night toward the particular blackness that precedes dawn, which is different from all other darkness, slightly thinner, slightly more provisional, as though the dark itself is beginning to have doubts. I had not slept. I was not tired. I was something I did not immediately have a word for, so I sat with the feeling the way the notebook had been teaching me to sit with things I couldn't immediately name. The last entry in the red notebook was brief. It said, "The other notebooks are yours to read in whatever order calls to you. Do not rush. The mountain will teach you the schedule. Your only task for the first week is to understand what you actually need versus what you have simply been told to want." These are almost never the same list. And below that, one final line, written in slightly larger letters as though the author had wanted to make certain it survived whatever might happen to the pages surrounding it: "You came here with less than you think. You will leave with more than you can currently imagine. Trust the distance between those two facts." I closed the notebook and set it carefully on the crate beside my daughter's photograph. Outside, through the small gap beneath the hut door, I could see the first gray suggestion of morning beginning to arrive at the base of the treeline. A bird called once from somewhere in the pines, a single note, clear and unelaborated, the kind of sound that exists only to mark the precise moment between one thing ending and another beginning. I sat on that cot in the cold and the near dark, and I did not feel homeless. I did not feel found, exactly. I felt something more preliminary than found. I felt locatable, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember. As though somewhere, on some map that mattered, there was now a point that corresponded to where I actually was. I did not leave that mountain for 4 months. And I have never been the same person who walked up that dirt track in the dying light. That person was also still me. He simply needed a red notebook and a mountain and 4 months of honest silence to remember what he had always, underneath everything, already known.